Today on Pilgrim Radio's His People, Hugh Ross on the impact of daylight savings on our sleep and our charity.
And one research study, they looked at millions of charitable donations to different organizations, and they noticed that the 4 weeks following the switch to daylight saving time, there was a 13% drop in charitable donations. And in the day following daylight saving time, there was a 45% drop. The immediate effect is dramatic, but it even lasts for a whole month. And then they looked at what happens when you gain an hour. You really don't see it being made up. And so charitable organizations suffer during the month following the switch to daylight saving time. And we're not just talking money. People donate less of their time.
That's Hugh Ross. Next. Spencer Dalkey is with Hugh Ross, the founder of Reasons to Believe, to discuss the effects on us of the recent change to daylight savings time. They're more extensive than you might think.
It's such an interesting idea that the shifting of our clocks, it affects our empathy and our generosity and these sorts of things. What sort of research have you found that introduced you to that idea?
3 research papers have been published in the scientific literature on the impact of sleep disruption or sleep deprivation. And yeah, with the switch to daylight saving times, a lot of people are not able to adapt quickly. And so there's a period of sleep deprivation. And one research study, they looked at millions of charitable donations to different organizations. And they noticed that the 4 weeks following the switch to daylight saving time, there was a 13% drop in charitable donations. And in the day following daylight saving time, there was a 45% drop. The immediate effect is dramatic, but it even lasts for a whole month. And then they looked at what happens when you gain an hour. You really don't see it being made up. And so charitable organizations suffer during the month following the switch to daylight saving time. And we're not just talking money. People donate less of their time. And so one research study, they said, well, let's get a bunch of volunteers. They got 136 volunteers, and they did studies on what happens when their sleep is disrupted or their sleep is deprived. And they noticed with MRI scans of the brain that there is a decrease in activity in those frontal lobes that are responsible for social engagement. So what they noticed was that with sleep deprivation, people don't socially engage like they normally do. They're less willing to help others. They're less willing to be altruistic. And they thought, well, maybe there's a difference between relatives and friends and complete strangers. They saw no difference. There was a drop in altruistic activity, even for close relatives, same as there was for helping total strangers.
It's sort of counterintuitive. I know we all kind of complain about the losing an hour in the spring, but it's 1 hour. Why is it that such a small shift affects our hearts so dramatically?
I travel a lot, and I notice where I'm switching, say, 3 or 4 time zones, I'm much more motivated to get on the new schedule. If it's only an hour, it's like I kind of ignore it. And this is where I think you get this effect. Because it's weird how if you're switching 4 time zones, you immediately recognize, hey, I got to eat my meals at the right time. I need to go to bed at the right time. And of course, when you're traveling on an airplane, you're always tired when you get off the plane. So it's like you're ready to go to bed. I think that's part of the explanation. It is a shock that it has this dramatic of effect. People thought it'd be relatively trivial. It's not trivial.
Even going on for, like you mentioned, like a whole month. How do nonprofits and faith communities prepare for that switch? Because, I mean, it's one thing to say, look at ourselves and prepare ourselves. But of course, nonprofits don't have that luxury of control, I guess, over their donor base.
They don't. I mean, I work for a charitable organization. It's like we're just prepared to recognize, hey, March isn't going to be a good month. And or we go to significant donors in February and say, this would be a good time to make a gift that will really help us hold over this period. So you kind of strategize on how to develop your appeals for gifts. And what I personally do, realizing that March is going to be a tough time for organizations, this is a time when my wife and I say, hey, we need to make an extra gift at this time because we know that there is going to be a drop-off.
Do you happen to know more about biologically what happens when we lose sleep? God has given us bodies. We are embodied creatures. So, what we do with our body affects our soul and, vice versa.
What all these studies show is that it impacts our circadian clocks. In other words, there's a lot of biological clocks within us, and the more advanced the creature, the more significant these clocks are. And since we humans are the most advanced animal species on the planet, we get impacted more than, say, our dog or a cat. But you probably also realize, hey, when you switch from a standard time to daylight saving time, it also affects the behavior of the pets that share your household. It's not easy for them to get used to a different eating time, for example, or a different playtime. So it's not just humans. But a couple of these research papers made an interesting study that it's not just daylight saving time. Other factors are impacting the disruption of our sleep or the loss of our sleep. So, for example, LED lighting has dramatically increased the nighttime illumination in big cities. And so studies are indicating that with this dramatic advance in LED lighting, people living in large cities aren't getting the sleep that they need, or their sleep is being disrupted. And studies show, for example, that people living in rural areas are more generous, they're more willing to help their neighbors, they're more willing to help strangers. And it's because they're not being impacted by LED lighting to the same degree that people are who are living in cities. And typically people living in large cities, they're often on a schedule where it's not just 8 to 5. They're working extra hours or taking work home, and therefore they're not getting the sleep that they need, or their sleep is being disrupted. So yeah, where you live also makes a big difference in how you behave.
It reminds me of all the reading of Wendell Berry that I've done recently. He keeps being relevant in my interviews, but he talks about a lot of our problems are industrial problems. With artificial lights, we can work later, and we don't really follow the patterns of the sun. And as an astrophysicist, you might be qualified to tell us about how the sun plays into our biology. But yeah, artificial lighting, what does that do for our circadian rhythms?
It definitely disrupts our rhythms, and not just us. I mean, there's been studies done where LED lighting in beach communities affects the fish and the coral reefs that exist just off the shore. We humans get impacted the most, but it's also impacting other life forms. And yeah, artificial nighttime lighting is progressively getting more and more intense, and it's even beginning to affect rural areas. This is becoming a global phenomena we need to pay attention to. And you mentioned that I'm an astronomer. I was a radio astronomer. And in doing radio astronomy, you basically observe around the clock. So you kind of ignore the sun and just keep going. But it does impact. I can recall, for example, having to do 6 days and nights of straight observations. When I was done with that observing schedule, I was actually hallucinating on the train ride back. Good thing I didn't try to drive. I wouldn't have made it.
How can people who work jobs like that try to find? I'll start with this. How do they find sleep?
We can do. So, for example, just being aware if you live in a large city, there's a lot of LED lightings. You can shut the blinds to block out that light. You can adjust the lighting in your home or the lighting in your office so it's not quite as disturbing as otherwise would be. And maybe you don't need to be working 14 hours a day. I think part of the problem is a lot of us have jobs we really like, and a lot of these jobs come with repetitive, tight deadlines. So you feel compelled to work more hours than you really should. I mean, it's well known, for example, that in spite of the fact that we live in the wealthiest nation of the world, people here in America work longer hours than people living in other parts of the world. I think a lot of it's the fact, number one, we got good jobs, we love our jobs, and the jobs are very demanding. So we're tempted to put in more hours than we should. And I think life balance is something we need to be paying attention to. I mean, I'm a little disturbed when I read scripture and it says, the love of the world will grow cold in the last days. Well, I think we're living in those days where we have all this technology, we have all this lighting, we have all this pressure, and yes, is beginning to impact the degree to which we're able to serve and meet the needs of other people.
I'm reminded of, I think it's Psalm 127:10 that talks about it's vain that you rise early in the morning and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, because God gives us sleep. Can you speak to that about like God's design for our humanity is that we sleep? How do we reclaim that in a busy culture of efficiency and technology?
Well, what's interesting about these research papers I've read is that number one, sleep deprivation affects the sexes in different ways. So, for example, when men are sleep deprived, they tend to make riskier decisions, and the women tend to avoid risk. And so, this actually is having an impact on our financial markets. I mean, people who are in, the financial market area, they're typically working long hours. They're not getting the sleep they need, but it winds up affecting the decisions and the advice they give to their clients. And so just being aware, hey, this has an impact. And I'm a research scientist. I get kind of captivated by my research. It's very enjoyable. It's even addicting. And I wind up putting more hours in than I should. But just reading these papers, it tells me if I'm not getting the sleep that God wants me to get, it actually impacts the quality of my thinking practice. I'd actually be more productive if I didn't put in so many hours on my scientific research, get the sleep that I need. It's going to enable me to make better decisions on how I respond to what I'm reading, the experiments I'm doing. So just having that self-awareness and also being aware, hey, with our 24/7 modern day technology, often it's not just we're being deprived of sleep, we're not eating the right foods, we're not getting the right exercise. I think that's one thing these research studies are telling us. These are all linked. You need to make sure you get the sleep you need, the quality of sleep you need, make sure you're eating the right foods and getting the right kind of exercise, mental exercise, and physical exercise. And also making sure you got social engagement. And incidentally, I have a son that's a clinical neuropsychologist. He says one of the things that really helps bring down the incidence of dementia is people getting adequate social engagement, mental exercise, physical exercise, and eating the right kinds of food.
That's very interesting. I want to ask more about that, but I know you also have thoughts about, since we are talking about daylight savings, how people can prepare themselves for the time change. I know we're past it by now, but you've talked about readjusting your schedule beforehand, things like this. What thoughts can you offer
I'll tell you
us?
what I do.
Yeah.
Knowing that daylight saving time is coming, about a week before the clocks change, I begin to change my sleep schedule by about 10 minutes a night. So it's a more gradual adjustment than getting hit with a sudden 1 hour change. And also changing the times in which I eat my meals. And also making sure that, hey, there's going to be disruption. I'm actually going to exercise more when daylight saving time hits rather than less. Because that's what happens. You lose an hour, you don't get the exercise you need. You may not be eating the foods you need. And so anticipating this, but start a week or two ahead of time.
My guest today is Hugh Ross. He's an astrophysicist. He's the founder of and senior scholar at Reasons to Believe, talking about daylight savings, how it affects our biology, how it affects our giving, charity. By the time this interview airs, even at the time of recording, we are past the time change. So maybe for those who have not done that, maybe they're finding themselves one of those people that they've been disrupted. What do you suggest they can do to recover more quickly?
Well, I mean, for example, I noticed that with my wife, even a month after daylight saving time has kicked in, she's still kind of struggling with the adjustment. And so, hey, it can be long lasting. And that's what these studies show. I mean, literally, there's a 4-month effect. It could be longer. They stopped the study at 4 weeks. If you're in that mode, this is a time to say, I know I got a lot on my plate. I got all these deadlines I need to make. Maybe making an appeal to your boss or to your family and saying, hey, I need more time to adjust, and taking the time that you need.
You've mentioned that March actually can be a very meaningful time Can you explain what you mean by that? What does that look like?
One thing I think is helpful is that when we're making that time zone change, this is when we're coming into spring. This is when you see the birds making nests. You get little creatures showing up. Spending a little more time outdoors might really help. And actually, it's helpful for your eyes. For example, there's a research study out of South Korea saying if you get up at sunrise and go for a walk, the reflection of sunlight off of the pavement and the ground, it actually is helpful for your eyes and will help reduce the level of nearsightedness that's very prevalent, for example, in the South Korean population, mainly because it's highly urbanized and people don't get out at the right time. Taking extra time to enjoy nature. And, of course, if you're living in Canada, for example, or Northern Europe, spring doesn't happen as early as March. But if you're living in a warmer climate, take advantage of just the wonderful things that happen when the seasons change.
We've been talking a lot about like very pro-human things, considering how God has designed us. Like it seems like even that would play into God is meant for us to be connected to the land and involved and in his creation and not in like these man-made structures, as good as, cities can be. How can our listeners nourish their humanity and flourish as human beings designed by God during this season's transition from winter to spring?
Well, I think something else is really important is, hey, when you're going through this time zone change, this is a time to reach out to your fellow human beings. I mean, when you lose an hour, it's like, okay, we really can't have our neighbors over or have our relatives over. No, this is a time I think you need to really look at your calendar and say, we need to have more social engagement. God made us as relational beings. And one of the pressures of high-tech urban society is almost forces that we withdraw from the normal social engagements. I think is one reason why we see way less of an impact than people living in rural areas. People living in rural areas tend to be more socially engaged with their neighbors and associates. And so just recognizing that, hey, I'm living in a big city. I got a high pressure job. This may be a time when I need to examine my life and saying, how often am I having people over? I mean, the Bible is very clear in this. We're to be hospitable. So look for opportunities to be hospitable. And hospitality is not just feeding people, it's taking time to listen to their social and spiritual needs, finding out how their life is. I have a couple I know really well, and every time we meet with them, they basically ask me, how's your soul doing? Rather than just making small talk, let's see if we can segue into something that's going to make for a more serious social engagement.
That's a good question. I like that. I might steal that, actually.
Sure, go for it.
Going back to, we were talking about the culture we live in, all the artificial light and things. A question that popped in my mind, I didn't ask it, is what does research show us about, since sleep, it seems, is very biologically wired into our being as depending on the sun. What is scientifically the difference between sunlight and artificial light?
There seems to be a difference because what I've noticed is people who live at high latitudes, in the wintertime, they're sleeping a lot. In the summertime, they're not. I've had to learn that, hey, if I get an invitation to speak in Alaska at the summertime, I'm going to be in for it. They're going to get me up at 6 a.m. They're going to keep me up till past midnight because, hey, they're on the sun. The sun's up. And they say, yeah, we sleep in the wintertime. It does show you the impact that the sun has on the way people live. And therefore, my wife has noticed that when we have LED lighting, let's get the lighting that's most like the spectrum that the sun gives out. And that indeed makes it easier. So if you're using, say, light that's more towards the blue end of the spectrum, maybe getting something more to the red end of the spectrum might actually be better. There's research studies actually showing that people who live in office buildings where they're being exposed to mercury lighting, which is very much towards the blue end, it does affect their social engagement. And so I tell people living in that environments, hey, if you're in a big office building, Rather than sending an email to your colleague that's 50 feet away, get up from your desk and go to his office and actually talk to them face to face rather than just using an email or grabbing them on a phone.
There's a lot more in that idea that could be explored. But I did want to ask, you've talked about preparing for daylight savings, going to bed earlier. I know in my own life, that's really hard to do, especially since we live in a culture that's very heart-based and we've kind of thrown off the idea of thinking and measuring what we feel by how we think about how we feel. Discipline is not a thing that's easy, that is common to come by, I suppose. What advice would you give to our culture for building disciplined habits for getting to bed at a reasonable hour?
Well, I think you need to be building discipline in many areas of your life. I mean, I notice that people living in the 21st century, it's hard for them to get daily, regular physical exercise or even daily, regular mental exercise, setting aside time. For those of us who are followers of Jesus Christ, when you read the scripture, it strongly encourages to have regular times of prayer and Bible reading and meeting together with our fellow believers. Once you build that kind of discipline into your spiritual life, I think it's easier to build it in to your emotional, intellectual, and physical life as well. So discipline needs to be pervasive, and things will come up where you have opportunities to meet other people's needs. That's kind of where you let your disciplinary patterns go. So it's a combination of being disciplined, but also being flexible and alert to opportunities that God provides. Again, it's all a matter of balance.
It's an opportunity to let our heads take the reins for a bit, especially if, we're tired people that, our generosity, like you mentioned earlier, kind of drops off the map. Being intentional, even, it seems like a very rational sort of activity that we need to kind of foster more as a culture, I suppose.
Well, there's research studies showing that, people living with high stress jobs in big cities, they'll be at their desk for 4 or 5 hours, and suddenly they're feeling fatigued. And recognizing that when you're fatigued, you're not going to be as mentally sharp. You're not going to be as sensitive to people's needs around you. Take a nap. Take a 20-minute nap. Then you can recover and actually be more productive. And you're probably going to be spending an extra half hour at the office anyway. Make sure that when nature taps you on the shoulder and just says, rather than just trying to push through the fatigue, take that as a time to say, you know what, I need to take a break. Take the appropriate break. But it also means that maybe in our office structures, we need to provide ways for people to say once in a while, maybe we need to have a 10-minute walk outside, just as a way to kind of refresh our minds and get started again.
This might be a bit of a loaded question, I guess, but what gives you hope, if at all, that we can reclaim healthier rhythms in a world that is so dominated by social media? We've spent 8 hours a day scrolling Instagram.
Yeah, I've read that the average amount of time that an American spends looking at a screen, whether it be a phone or a computer or a tablet, it's 11 hours a day. So that's a lot of time you're spending staring at a screen. There are health consequences for doing that. But the problem is we live in a day, I, for example, spend a lot of time working on my computer, morning, evening, afternoon. And so just recognizing I have a watch that tells me that I need to stand up after an hour. Pay attention to that smartwatch. Get away from your screen. Walk around for a minute, then come back to your screen. Maybe there's things that we can do where we're not focused on the screen. Again, I like the idea that rather than sending one of my colleagues an email, actually get up and go into his office and talk to him face to face. That way he gets off the screen, I get off the screen. And I think there's benefits in doing that.
Considering all of the things that might disrupt our sleep, of course, we've been talking about daylight savings, screens with artificial light. You mentioned work stress, maybe cortisol levels gets in the way of us getting good sleep. Are there perhaps winding down activities that you think scientifically, biologically would help us get good sleep?
Well, one thing I do is because, I have to work evenings a lot in my job. My evening work, I'm going to make sure it doesn't have a tight deadline or it involves a really stressful problem that needs to be solved right away. I'll do that in the morning or early afternoon. Reserve the evenings for those things where that kind of stress is not an issue. Because if I try to go to sleep with all that stress on my mind, I'm probably not going to be able to get to sleep for an hour. So just making sure, hey, I'm not going to do that. And then finding the best time to get your physical exercise is different for every person, but just experimenting, figuring what's the best time to do certain disciplinary things in my life, trying to work with your circadian rhythms and trying to find what's the best time. And again, experiment. I'm a scientist, so I've done that. Just trying, hey, maybe if I adjust my schedule in a different way, maybe I'll see some benefit. Or maybe I adjust how much time I spend eating my food or what kinds of food I eat at different times of the day. Those kinds of experiments can be fun. Give it a go.
How would you recommend people measure that? You're a scientist. You might have thoughts about how to track data and measure how our circadian rhythms are oriented as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for years, trying to figure out, okay, what's the best time to exercise? How long should I exercise? Should I try to break it up? I find I do better if I kind of pack it all into one episode. My wife gave me one of these bathroom scales which sends electric currents through you and basically measures your bone mass, your muscle mass, your fat mass, and where it is in different parts of the body. It measures your biological age. So it actually helps you track. If I change my activity, does it affect the numbers I read on the scale? So it's actually helping me to do the experiments. Consequently, I've changed the way I eat. I changed the way I exercise. I changed my work schedule because I actually have this thing feeding back to me on the physical benefits of different changes in my schedule. Let's use the technology for our own benefit.
You've been listening to His People on Pilgrim Radio. Many thanks to our guest, Hugh Ross, the founder of Reasons to Believe. Go to reasons.org. On tomorrow's program, it's Jeremy Linneman on pouring out our hearts in prayer.
And I just have the stresses of everyday life. I think of them almost like wild monkeys that are just right next to me when I wake up, and they're already, jumping and howling. And there's an anxiety that can come with that. But I think our hearts are designed to be poured out, that we feel all these things going on. And the right thing to do, what God has designed us to do, is just to let those things flow in prayer to the Father.
That's tomorrow at the same time, right here on The Pilgrim. Thanks for listening.